Hey, everybody. Welcome to PGSCP's webinar on navigating supply chain in 2022. We're just going to give this maybe just a couple more seconds. I see people are getting on. I'll introduce our guests and just our speakers, I should say, not the guests. I'm the guest. They're the main event in just a couple seconds. Actually, why don't we go ahead and get started? I think we've got a good audience here already. All right, so today's speakers are Jim Martin, the founder of PGSCP, Dr. Russell Hudson, Rethinking Success, and previously of many years of procurement and supply chain at HP, also a business school professor. I'll let them introduce themselves as well. And I'm Peter Bonney. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Vendorful. So Jim, do you want to go ahead and tell people a little bit about yourself?
Thank you, Peter. As he said, I'm Jim Martin, and I've been involved in supply chain and sales for now 33 years. So I've seen quite a bit change, a lot of action, a lot of different conditions and so forth throughout my career. And possibly this is one of the most dynamic. I'm right now working for a very large global software organization. I've spent time at other companies in the media and entertainment business, finance, banking. So I've had a focus mostly on the services side, and quite a bit of change has occurred since I first started in the late 80s, from carbon paper and copies and dot matrix printers for purchase orders and so forth to the e-procurement environment that we're in. And I will say this, that some of the things I learned all those years ago, those things still apply today, and some of the basic elementary stuff that you need to carry forward. So I'm looking forward to a positive engagement and hearing what my peers have to say across the globe. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. And to that end, I should mention before we move on, this is intended to be an interactive event. So if you have questions or comments as we go through, please put them in the chat, and we'll pose them to our distinguished speakers here. With that, Dr. Hudson, would you like to introduce yourself to the audience?
Absolutely. Thanks, Peter, and thanks to everyone for joining. As noted, my name is Russell Hudson. I have been in procurement and supply chain for 34 years. Back when I started, it was called purchasing, but it has evolved quite a bit over the past 30 plus years. I started out as a buyer with Cummins Diesel, and then have progressed through a variety of other companies, all Fortune 500 kind of companies, Motorola, Compaq, Gateway, and the last 25 years with HP. I just recently retired from HP at the end of January. Retired in the sense that I'm just trying to catch a new wave, so to speak, into what is the next phase of life. While at HP, I was a supply chain strategist, which is a little bit different terminology at HP than other companies. But a supply chain strategist at HP is kind of an elected position. It's sort of like getting tenure at university. You have to go before a board. It's a very limited number of people in the organization. I was fortunate enough to achieve that. I was also the director of procurement strategy and operations for the direct materials group. And I also acted as the chief economist for the company, kind of as a sideline. My doctorate is not in economics. My doctorate is in business strategy, but there's a lot of underlying economics there. And I've spent a lot of time working outside the organization as well as inside HP, developing the term supply chain economics, which I've written about and done some presentations about, and did a lot of presentations and publishing inside of HP. I published what I called some supply chain economic analysis reports. I published the last one 2 days before I retired. I don't know exactly how many. I could only find records of 379, but I presented that over the years. And anyway, there's more on my LinkedIn if you want to know more about my background or what I've written. I'll stop here so as not to take away from the discussion here, but very pleased and happy to be a part of the team here today.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hudson. we'll be distributing this this slide deck as well as the recording to whoever wants it after the event, so you don't have to worry about copying this stuff down. But there are links to some selected publications from Dr. Hudson in the slide deck. So with that, let's get to the meat of the discussion. So I'm going to let our distinguished guest here, do most of the talking. I just want to kind of set the stage here for where we've been and then the uncertainty about where we're going. So where we've been, this is the hopefully tail end of a multi-year global pandemic. It has seen massive supply chain disruptions. Even more recently, we've seen inflation and price increases at levels unseen for decades prior. And the latest, sort of tragic wrinkle to all of this is the largest European land war since World War II. So where we're going, I mean, I guess, the world is starting to adapt to life with endemic COVID. The sort of the opportunity to nip that in the bud was sort of gone a long time ago. Possibly related, there's no visible end to supply chain disruptions that people are seeing. Inflation expectations continue. Conflict in Ukraine is certainly not helping that. And then obviously the uncertainty over the Ukraine situation itself and where and how that will end and where it goes from here. So there's a lot going on, a lot for people to be concerned about. And what I want to start talking about is inflation. It seems to be front of mind for everybody in procurement, everybody in supply chain. And one of the interesting things that hold on, we have somebody asking about audio. Hopefully everyone is hearing us. If you aren't, please post that in the chat. But Todd, I think hopefully you're the only one not hearing anything. So one of the interesting things about the link between supply chain and inflation is that a survey of CEOs at the tail end of 2021 found that most are pretty much across the board are viewing supply chain bottlenecks as the number one cause of inflation. Now, inflation is also a contributor to supply chain problems. So, curious to get Jim and Dr. Hudson your thoughts on sort of how inflation and supply chain kind of feed on each other and interact.
Dr. Hudson, please go first.
Well, I think I would start out by saying, the problem with any kind of inflation, and especially in the supply chain, is it tends to spiral. That's always why there's a concern by central banks about inflation, is because expectations become muted over time. You just get used to it, and it ceases to be transitory, and it tends to be sticky. And I think that's one reason that executives worry about that, because stickiness is not a good thing on supply chain inflation when you can't pass it through. And because it only comes funded out of one area of the income statement, and that's net profit. So that's a concern. But I think the other thing is that, the concern is, and I look back on my own personal career, I think that we've seen so many of these incidents that have agglomerated in the past 24 months. As I look back over, the past 34 years, I've seen, different things. When I started in 1988, the big problem was I was buying parts from Japan, and there was a yen-dollar problem at the time, and the exchange rates and the so forth that was driving, a lot of concern. But it's not just that now. We have, currency, we've got geopolitical things, we've got commodity markets, we've got interest rates. All of these things kind of have agglomerated into a situation amplified and kind of gaslit by this pandemic that has affected everybody. It's not just been something that we see on TV. It has been something that has affected everybody personally, no matter where you live. And so I think that just the agglomeration of all of those things has made this at least seem worse than it's ever been before. In some cases, it may be worse than it has been before, but it has certainly elevated the discussion about bottlenecks, about supply chain risks, and about inflation. And I would say one of the good things that could come out of this, one of the things that I discussed with my team before I left HP is I said, I think the silver lining, so to speak, in all of this is that it gives us now an opportunity to have the conversations that we should have been having prior to all of this. You know, there's an old ancient, proverb about the best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago. The second best time is to do it today. And there's a lot of things around risk and inflation and supply chain and so forth that we probably should have done in the past. I know my team should have done in the past, but we didn't do it. But the good news is that this is giving us an opportunity to get people's attention. People want to talk about it now, as evidenced by this slide here, that is now giving an opportunity for the conversation. And I would hope that it would be, a persistent conversation and not just transitory.
Well, so that's an interesting, raises an interesting question for me. And, Jim, I'd be curious to get your perspective on it, as well as yours, Dr. Hudson. I guess every crisis is also an opportunity. And as you said, there are investments that organizations perhaps should have been making all along, or risks that should have been addressed all along, and now they're front of mind and getting attention. Of course, the challenge with dealing with an emergency is, especially when you're dealing with the C-suite, is they want it solved yesterday. They don't want to hear about a plan to solve it, over the next 2 to 5 years. But some of those investments are going to take that kind of time to really play out. So how would you recommend sort of communicating with the C-suite about both like the urgent situation and dealing with it, but also like thinking longer term about sort of more structural issues?
Well, I think it is absolutely two sides of a coin, right? I mean, you certainly, if the building's on fire, you want to put the fire out. But the real way to increase the value in the building is not to have future fires or to prevent fires. And that's not a real topic that people get very excited about, because nobody likes fire drills. Nobody likes doing kind of some of this work. But I think that the good thing is this is an opportunity to create those conversations and also to create kind of that dual channel of communication to say, yes, we want to put out the fire, but we also want to create a situation, a strategy where we can prevent or at least have some insight into the next fire. Maybe you're not able to prevent it. You're not able to predict anything. Nobody's a psychic here. A lot of things that are on this slide and a lot of things that have happened in the world, I don't think was on anybody's bingo card 2 years ago, or even 12 months ago, or even 3 months ago. But it's about being aware and about also developing that muscle and that discipline to not only put out the fire, but also engage in a conversation about the prevention of the future fire. And to your point, I think most C-suite executives certainly don't want to hear that. But now that you have an opportunity because of a crisis, that is always the opportunity to create change. I always used to tell this to my students, my dad never quit smoking. He never lost 20 pounds. He never started walking 30 minutes a day until he had a heart attack. And he did all of those things after he had a heart attack. But the best time to do those three things is before you have a heart attack and 6 bypass surgeries. And so, again, this is the opportunity to have the conversation and to hammer home, yes, we're going to put out the fire, but let's also focus on preventing the next fire.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. So to go a little deeper on inflation, certainly McKinsey's view and my view as well is that it's helpful to sort of start from a framework of understanding and analysis. So what are both the drivers of your particular company's costs and potential areas for inflation, as well as overall what sort of opportunities do you have in areas that may not be inflating as much to sort of either try and actually drive down prices, even if by a tiny amount, to offset things, areas that are inflating, or just to lock in prices for a little bit longer in areas that may not be subject to the same inflation pressures as, say, oil or agricultural products right now. So to that end, we actually kind of got some, Jim solicited some input from members of PGSCP. And here are some results of that, some interesting insights. So Andre in Poland talked about implementing pricing mechanisms with quarterly revisions, spending the time to actually put together some formulas for understanding their pricing, considering the primary cost factors for their business, and then looking to do multi-sourcing wherever possible to get leverage over the suppliers. Alan from Cameroon had another interesting thing to add to this mix. Now, in his case, he was able to work with their R&D and production teams. They're in food business. They actually altered some of their recipes to use more locally sourced wheat and less imported wheat to help them address the cost of transportation. So what are some other things that you think that people should be doing right now to, if not, say, offset inflation, at least try to minimize the impact going forward?
I'll start with a little bit of an exercise that my team did beginning this past November. So we didn't know what the impact was going to be for our 2022 budgets, with two things that we have to face. Inflation is going to definitely relate to what prices that we may be paying. And for the products that we're offering, are we offering it at the right amount, right? We want to balance and make sure that we're not below inflation in that respect. And wage pressures too. Are people going to be departing and so forth? Long story short, the best way that we decided to approach it is, let's grab all our contracts with our key suppliers. So it amounted to roughly 300. And we just started reviewing them. And it was a back to basics, and kind of, as Dr. Hudson was saying, it's, you don't do this stuff until something happens. And this was that life-altering event. And it was a little bit eye-opening that we didn't have the protective language on price controls, because we do sometimes, particularly in the US marketplace, there's a focus on making sure those terms and conditions are adhered to and so forth, where pricing is secondary. How you're negotiating it, it's going to be subject to maybe CPI, consumer price index, or producer price index increases and so forth. But what was alarming was that we didn't have really strong language to protect us against pricing, or to at least allow us to know what might come or be notified and so forth and so on. So that's something that we've implemented going forward in any new agreements, and going back to our key suppliers and saying, what's the impact? If there's telecom equipment that we need because we're doing a refresh in a particular office, well, did we budget for this back in July of 2021, and now we're getting it now? And what's the differentiation between that, right? So it's changed that much, and making sure that the individuals in those C-suites know this is what's happening. We're doing whatever we can to mitigate it, but there's only in some cases so much we can do. If you can substitute for another product, that's one thing, but adding the pandemic woes for supply chain, that's easier said than done, right? So it actually became a combination of, well, I can get it, and I have to pay a little bit more, but I need it. So I'm willing to accept those two detrimental cases to be able to make sure that this project has to move forward.
Yeah, go ahead, Dr. Hudson.
I was just going to add on to that's a great point from James about creating that optionality, right? And again, those I think are things that are overlooked in times of calm, where you just want to get the contract done, you want to get it purchased, you want to get the agreement done, and again, you're not really thinking about sometimes the future state of what could be an escalator or even a de-escalator. Right. And, creating optionality for yourself and for your firm and for your supplier, and that supply chain is best done when you're not in the crisis. Right? It's, again, that's like putting out the fire. You may have to do it now. You may have to go pull those 300 contracts and go renegotiate now. But the longer term benefit, the longer term strategy is to keep that in motion and to keep that a part of your DNA going forward, to create that optionality, and don't just do it when the house is on fire.
Yeah, and I'll actually throw in one little tidbit just from the software side of this. A CPO I spoke with told me that when COVID started, and the first, sorry, I should say when the first lockdown started, the initial kind of disruptions there, their operations team came to them and said, "Hey, we need to know the force majeure language of all of our contracts." And that was something that nobody had ever really thought about. I mean, they thought about force majeure in individual contract negotiations, but in aggregate, they had not thought about what might happen if there was a force majeure event and we needed to actually understand the impact on factory operations. So it's a painful exercise to have to go through if you're not already tracking that information in some kind of supplier information management system or contracts management system, but necessary, and like as you've both said, no time like the present.
There's things that just drop and no one's expecting it. About 3.5 years ago, I was doing some consulting work, and this was particularly the U.S. market, but there was a little bit of a trade friction between the U.S. and China, and suddenly there was a tariff in place, right? And those low-cost solutions of bringing something in, they suddenly weren't there, and you had buyers that had planned 1 or 2 years out for this and had no idea of how to deal with this impact and passing it along. So it was amazing to me how slow it was to stop people to look and try. Maybe there's other options, sourcing closer to home or sourcing to other countries in Asia and so forth. And there is a tendency when things are working good, you don't want to disrupt it. And because we don't have the time, right? And it's just nature. You don't stop to say, okay, things are going too well today. What's the next disaster that's going to happen, and how is that going to be? What can we predict, and what can we do? You can only do so much as far as risk is concerned. I guess over the years, and you mentioned procurement, Dr. Hudson. When I first started too, was purchasing procurement. I've seen lots of things. It's just not being surprised and being ready to employ any kind of a strategy to adjust to those circumstances.
Yeah, that made me think of, this is a non-procurement example, but a colleague of mine, his name is Adam Grant. He's an organizational psychologist at the Wharton School. And pre-pandemic, he was wanting to do some research about hybrid work. And he had approached a number of CEOs at some companies to see if he could run an experiment where people would work from home on Fridays. And he was, again, wanting to study about the effect on teams and collaboration and all that. He was turned down by everybody, right, for his study. And then in March of 2020, everybody worked from home. And the point is, I heard him make this point, wouldn't it have been great if people had learned the lessons about hybrid work from home, or what I was calling living at work, prior to the pandemic, and we would have learned some of these lessons, learn some best practices, learn about teams and collaboration, and not have it forced on teams, and learn as they go and create some of the negative effects that we've seen over the past 2 years about burnout, exhaustion, and so forth. So again, I think it's just being open and being able to think like a scientist and not think like a manager.
Yeah, anecdotally, the interesting thing about the mass work from home experiment is I have heard managers, not just employees, but managers at different companies running teams doing the same thing. So running procurement, supply chain teams with completely conflicting results say. I've spoken to some who have said they can't believe the productivity increases that they've had. Everyone is much happier. Everyone's more productive, and there's no way they're ever going back to full time in the office now that they've done, either work from home or some kind of hybrid. And then there are other people who have said they've seen drastic impacts, negative impacts on team morale, on team productivity, and the work from home experiment was a total failure. And I'm sure it has something to do with culture and tooling of each of the individual companies, but that is fascinating to me.
Well, and again, I think my point was, boy, wouldn't it have been great? Wouldn't we all have benefited if Adam had been able to do his work and done able to do some science on this, and we learned about it before we had to do it, than when we had to do it, right?
Right.
And that's kind of like back to my putting out the fire example. It would have been really great if we had some research, some literature to go on, instead of experiencing it as we go and creating, in some cases positive effects and in other cases negative effects, because we didn't know how to do it, right? And I think that's the same thing about I know it's, again, not a purchasing example or procurement example, but I think it relates to what James was saying. If you do it proactively and you do it in those times when it may not have the same, it's not it doesn't feel like a great time to do it. That's the best time to do it. Is to be proactive with it. And if you can create that conversation and create those learnings before you have to, then I think it's certainly a much higher probability of success.
Okay, great. So I do, in the interest of time, I want to move on past just strictly talking about inflation and on to some other things. But it is interesting. We have a poll here. So far, the vast majority of respondents are saying they are seeing price increases from suppliers in areas that ought to be insulated from inflation, like software, which is, sort of not obviously impacted by increases in raw material prices, to an extent by labor prices, but it's a very, very tenuous connection there. So that's an interesting observation.
It feels like, well, everybody does it. Let's raise our prices, right? And you're accustomed to the conditions to say, okay, I guess the price has gone up, and I'm paying X amount of dollars for gas, petrol, whatever. It's accepted, and don't accept it. Okay, show me why.
Yep. It's simple, but it's a great advice. So one of the this headline here on this slide is about inventory, but there's another thing I want to highlight here. But let's start by talking about again in the theme of where we've been versus where we're going. So these are results of two polls conducted in the middle of 2020 and then the middle of 2021. So starting in 2020, this was a forward-looking poll about investments that supply chain teams were looking to make. And there were a lot of things focused on, flexibility, increasing resilience, business continuity, kind of, the sorts of structural improvements that will pay long-term benefits. Looking back at what actually happened, it turned out there was, a lot of increasing of inventories, and then, all sort of, both locally and along the supply chain. And increasing inventories is effective in terms of resilience. It's a blunt tool, but it works. So I have two questions here for discussion. So I'll start with one, then I'll pose the second. So I guess, like the slide says, is inventory no longer a four-letter word, or is this sort of a blip that will change back?
Well, I'll go first. Having retired from my job at the end of January, was part of my team managed HP's investment in direct material inventory, so I have a little bit of insight into that. Again, I won't betray any proprietary information. I will refer you to HP's latest earnings from last week, and you can look at the IR slides, and total inventory at HP was up I believe, $2.4 billion year on year, for a variety of reasons. Number one, you're buying more. Number two, the price inflation that we talked about. But I guess where I want to go with this is that in a way, inventory still is a four-letter word, because one of the things that, again, just based on my limited experience from my team, and I'm sure other people have a different point of view, but one of the things that gets caught up with inventory is this irrational exuberance. Number one, you start hoarding, and you wind up hoarding the wrong stuff. And in our case, again, without getting into any proprietary information, we had a particular product that had a significant demand spike due to the pandemic. So everybody believed that this demand spike was going to be permanent, and everybody was going to need this product. You're going to need 2 or 3 of these products, where prior to the pandemic, this was a very low-level product. And so what we did is we invested a lot of inventory in those products because we wanted to be able to supply those products. But guess what? It turned out to be transitory, not permanent. And so a significant portion of when I left on January 31st of my inventory was about 25% of my total inventory was tied up in that almost unusable stuff now. So I think you have to be very careful with that. You can't just go grab with both hands, because especially if you're dealing in the sector that I was in, maybe it works if you're buying paper towels, where it doesn't matter other than the carrying cost. But I think you have to be careful about that. But it is the easiest tool to do, but it can be a hammer looking for a nail, and it can have some consequences.
Yeah, I want to just touch on that point, hoarding the wrong stuff. And I thought that was such a poignant phrase. By the way, if anybody's interested in 182,000 masks, talk to me afterwards, because these are the things that we originally thought were going to be needed in 2020. So those were reactive decisions. But I'm seeing, in terms of inventory, let's not take a chance in disappointing customers. Let's not be out of stock on it, and we'll eventually catch up. We will be able to exceed expectations because we can get it there. There won't be necessarily a delay on our side, but then there's an equation to this that's forgotten is, okay, it's here. How are you going to get it from here to there and the time that they want if there's backlogs in a lot of transportation hubs? If there's just pandemic shortages of employees to be able to move things from point A to point B. So again, that causes a buildup unnecessary, and it's not kind of flowing through the pipeline to where it needs to get to. So trying to calm people down and say it will eventually even itself out. It's not an easy discussion to have, because it is kind of like what Dr. Hudson said. It's irrational exuberance. You just want to make sure it's there without giving it any serious thought. Is it going to be really needed?
Yeah, well, that actually brings up my next question about this. Is Dr. Hudson, as you sort of highlighted early on, when there is an emergency, you first want to start by putting out the fire. And Jim, your example of the masks, it's perhaps an overreaction to conditions at the time, but clearly driven by a desire to focus, first on, okay, we got to deal with this immediate emergency. Now, another interesting thing I see sort of with the juxtaposition of these two poles is that it is easier to do some of these kind of, crude, blunt initiatives to try and focus on like what's the immediate pain. And it is harder to sustain the effort and the organizational attention for longer term changes. It's sort of like the kind of structural projects that we're talking about. So how do you think people should be going about trying to maintain executive attention on, sort of like the longer term, less focused on like the near term pain of like our supply chain is problematic right now versus like, let's, build this out so that 5, 10, 20 years from now, when something like this happens again, we're not in the same position.
Well, I think from my perspective, as I said earlier, I think you just have to be very persistent in that message, and use that bully pulpit, so to speak, and continue to hammer it home. Continue to hammer it home with data, and stories within your own organization. With all due respect to our friends on this slide here, and they're 2x2 matrices and all that kind of stuff. I think that, they hijack the conversation a little bit too much. And you need to, it was my experience talking to folks in our C-suite. If you could make it very personal to our company and to our products, and not stay in the esoteric and in the macro, but get it into the micro about what it means for us and what are we doing about it? What are the investments that we need? This is what the payoff is going to be. But just continually hammer that and prosecute that message, and not be in the flavor of the day and get caught up in this kind of, TikTok mentality of these sound bites that move on and that are kind of breezy, but just continue to prosecute the case and evangelize the case with data, and get their attention repeatedly. Then I think that is, at least from my experience, that was the way that I was able to begin to prosecute the case. I mentioned in my biography that I had probably written over 500 supply chain economic reports. That began with one presentation in 2006 that my boss at the time asked, because again, I don't remember what the crisis was, but something was happening in 2006. I don't know if it's copper or something, but I was asked to come to the boardroom and explain this to people that made a lot more money than me, what was going on. And that one conversation turned into a repeated conversation, and I just hammered that home. And I was never assigned that. I never got paid extra for it. But I became the prosecutor of that supply chain economic message, for 15 years. And I became known as the economist. So again, I just think it's just something you have to continue to beat the drum on, and not become very fatty, because a year from now, McKinsey will show up with other slides and other stuff. Don't let them hijack the conversation just because they charge a lot more money than the rest of us get paid. Just continue to hammer it home and use your bully pulpit to tell the story. That is my point of view.
And use your numbers. So if you are using your how you're being measured for success, and your numbers are telling a good story, then you want to continue to do that. If your numbers aren't, then find out why and address it, and dig down and understand that. And is it an internal cause? Is it an external cause? And even that's a legitimate reason for telling a story, right? I identified, we fixed. And numbers always tell the story. And if
Exactly.
Everybody that's listening, right? If you're going to make the case for any kind of change and whatever it is, it's generally the numbers. Make the numbers tell the story.
Sorry to interrupt you, but exactly, that's exactly right. One of the things I used to do for my former boss when we would do our operational reviews with the chief supply chain officer is, and I was always in charge of writing and producing that story. And I did it in different formats, but to your point, James, we started out with a slide called By the Numbers, right? Where it literally was numbers and what did that number represent? And it might be transactions, it might be cost, it might be quality, whatever it was, right? There was no graphs or anything to it. It was a story by the numbers. And you get people's attention, with that. Especially at that time, that particular chief supply chain officer was very quantitative, and it was a way to draw him in, right? It's like watching a movie, right? I mean, screenwriters here in Los Angeles are taught you've got to get them in the first 5 minutes or that you lose them, right? So you've got to be able to figure out a way to do that. And, you know, the best way to do it is very much to your point, James, you know, not with the anecdote, but you start with the numbers and make it real for your organization. Not so much these esoteric McKinsey numbers.
Yeah, that's great. So I was going to ask this at the end, but I think it's sort of relevant now. So we have a question here from John. How do we turn supply chain into a competitive weapon? And I think that you know, ties into questions of how do you actually you know, not only what the strategy is, but then how do you actually make that happen with the organization?
Well, I think that's a tough question, right? Because I think as I go back to 1988 when I started, that was a question being asked then about strategic purchasing. That was the term that was used, and how to get the seat at the table and how to you know, create that visibility. I think one thing that has changed since I started in 1988 is that when we talk about supply chain today, it has become very synonymous with the value chain, right? When Michael Porter created that phrase back in 1985, you know, it got a lot of airplay. And you look at his original model, you know, there was a procurement function in there and there was a logistics function in there. But I think one of the things that's happened is that those are not just seen as functions now. In many organizations, the value chain really is the supply chain. And these events that we're talking about today, that we've all experienced in the past 24 months, you know, continue to illuminate that. And, you know, you can see that certain firms are in certain industries do it better and that are more agile and that are, you know, producing the results. But it is something that happens because of concerted effort. It doesn't happen just because you show up. You know, you can't, you know, I have a friend of mine that does Ironman competitions where you run thousands of miles and bike and all that kind of stuff. You can't just show up on Saturday of the day of the event and participate, right? There's a lot of prep work that goes into doing that. And again, I think if you can sell that discipline and what that payoff is going to be versus your competitors, that is a way to help marshal the resources and the mindset and to get it off of the transactional and into the strategic.
For me, I would say I don't have enough hours in the day. But if I was given some more time, I would like to learn more about how the internal stakeholders develop their products, what they're looking at in terms of their competitors, and see what can supply chain manager, what can my team do to make them better. And quite often it's relegated to, we have a contract up for review. It's the standard stuff. We need to run an RFP. So being able to do that and take the time to understand that, it will have an impact in what you're able to contribute. And hopefully you're strengthening their value story to the client base, and you're included. I like the reminder of the seat at the table, because again, we have about the same starting point, Dr. Hudson, in terms of procurement, purchasing, supply chain. It's evolution through the years, and it's been that fight. It's been making this relevant, and for the first time that I can see in the last 30 years, supply chain was used at some point in 2021 almost every day in every news broadcast that you were hearing. So that but then the question is, do people really understand it? And if you have internal stakeholders that need that help, need that guidance, that are willing to show you what they do, where can you fit in here? That's going to be, I think, a plus to help that competitiveness. I'm not sure about a competitive weapon, but certainly pulling more of our intelligence and what we're able to bring to the table to help them.
Great. So a couple more insights from actual practitioners here, sort of relevant to the last slide. Joao was his company did increase inventories like a lot of companies. You know, reasonable priority, try to keep the factories working. You know, focus on cost savings later. But to do more structural changes to address inflation and supply going forward, doing more RFQs, more multi-sourcing, considering all opportunities, no matter how small. And then Ilker in Turkey, again, on sort of the more strategic side, talking about implementing a risk plan based on detailed product analysis and a portfolio analysis. And then, looking at the individual suppliers and individual sectors and contracts and implementing more structure around everything they were doing, which I think is key, if I'm understanding both of you correctly.
Absolutely.
Yeah, great. So in the interest of time, I kind of want to jump to the sort of focus areas for 2022. That's again, consultant polls here, but interesting that this is all obviously pre-Ukraine, but people were focused on supply chain planning and sourcing and procurement as sort of the top two things here. And then within supply chain planning, demand planning and forecasting and analytics, sort of the top two items. And then within sourcing and procurement, supplier relationship management is sort of the key focus. And all of this sort of makes sense in the light of everything we're discussing, everything we're seeing. It's all about having data, having the numbers, having visibility, all the things you were just talking about. These are the prerequisites for any kind of, or I would think they're the prerequisites for any kind of well-structured program or strategic initiative. So anything here surprising to you, or does this make sense?
Well, certainly not surprising to me. I mean, when I started in October of 1988, the forecast was wrong. And when I left on January 31st, the forecast was wrong. And long after I'm dead, the forecast is going to be wrong. And, a lot of people forget that, forecast by definition is wrong, right? That's what it is. I think the takeaway is, and this was something I was never able to really get across to many of my managers, is it's not about making the forecast right. It's about making it less wrong. And, it's not going to be perfect. You don't need it to be perfect. We operate in a world where, the forecast for today's temperature here in Los Angeles, probably not correct, but it's not off by, a factor of 20. So, I can at least tolerate it, and I know how to plan my day. And I think that's one thing that we have to think about, that there is going to be some elasticity. It's going to be wrong. But what are the implications if it is wrong? What is our reaction, our strategy going to be if it is wrong to the upside or to the downside, or the mix is different, and those kind of things? I think those are great conversations that kind of get missed, at least from my experience and from my previous organization. They just seem to be one of those people that are every day trying to buy a lottery ticket, trying to win the fortune, right? Trying to get it right, and they never get it right. And I just think that that's a mindset to certainly have. To the bottom of this slide, investing in those relationships, and also the analytics that you bring to those relationships, right? How do you understand the value chain, and what are the cost drivers? What are the demand drivers? One of the little side papers I'm working on right now about this whole thing about supply chain economics and the value chain is an egg. Right? Because eggs are very expensive right now. They're up 13% year over year. And that sounds like something that's not as cool as semiconductors or Intel processors. But, as I've studied that, I realized, the greatest contributor to the cost of eggs is chicken feed. That's the greatest, impact to the cost of eggs. And my point is, I don't buy eggs. I don't even eat eggs. But using that as an illustration and understanding what are the fundamental underlying drivers, again, I think can help you if you are a buyer of eggs, and you're negotiating the price of eggs, or you're creating contracts like James was talking about earlier, or you're trying to create optionality. Those kind of analytics and understanding the fundamentals at least helps you inform the conversation, gives you more power in the negotiation, and helps, I think, inform the strategies that you want to be able to pursue.
Great. All right, that seems like a great place to end. We've gone a little bit over time here, but this has been a great discussion. I appreciate both of you taking the time to do this. I'll reiterate to the audience here that we're going to have the recording of this available as well as the slides. If there are any last minute questions, feel free to get them in here. But while we're waiting for that, somebody just asked about seeing the full webinar afterwards. You'll receive a link by email that will go out after some time to process the video, but that will the platform will automatically send that out. With that, any closing remarks either of you want to make?
I think if you haven't seen it in the chat, somebody was just so touched by Dr. Hudson's the comment about the forecast, right? And that's resonating. And I'd like to continue that. This to me, I appreciate the fact that you were able to give us your time, Dr. Hudson, because it's like real world experience and practical steps on how to do things, or just, hey, forecasts aren't right. And then I sometimes feel like there's sort of an element, not dishonesty, but just everything's fine, everything's right. No, we need to have more of these basic discussions. How are our systems? Are they giving us the information that we need? Do I have the data to make these projections, and can I stand by it? And ultimately, we make mistakes, right? Don't make the same mistakes, but learn from them and just keep on improving that. And if you can bring your suppliers in as partners as much as you possibly can, then that to me would be appropriate closing thoughts in my mind from this, and to go from there.
Yeah, absolutely. I have a friend of mine in Palo Alto who's a psychologist, and he has a famous saying where he says, "Nobody ever learns from success. You only learn from failures." Right. So, that's a great, thing to think about, that the failures are really you're learning. And that's really kind of what science is all about. And that's kind of, the scientific method. And I think we need more of that. And I think we need more of it in our profession. Because we are really at a fulcrum in our organizations, no matter what size your organization is, whether you're a Fortune 50 company like I just retired from, or you're in a startup or whatever. I think this function, I think that has become a universal truth from when I started until today. It is a very important function, sometimes an underrated function, but we have a lot of possibilities if we can, utilize the platform that we have and the influence that we have to prosecute our case, and we can make a difference, to our organization and its competitiveness. Because it's like the old joke of the two guys in the woods being chased by the bear. And they start running, and the one guy says, "Why are you running? You can't outrun the bear." And the guy says, "Look, I don't have to outrun the bear. I just have to outrun you." And the point is, you don't have to cream your competitor. All you have to do is be a little bit better and have a little bit more information and a little bit better strategy and a better execution, and you're going to create an advantage, for yourself.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Hudson. For everyone in the audience, you can find Dr. Hudson probably most easily on LinkedIn. And you can find PGSCP on LinkedIn or on the web.
Find Dr. Hudson's writings and block a half hour of your day, and it's very refreshing. I highly recommend it.
Well, thank you guys for having me and everything. I really appreciate it.
Great. Thank you for everyone for attending, and wish everyone have a great day, and we'll talk to you all later.
Thank you, everyone.
Take care.